A ver si nos sentamos, nos dejamos de saludar. Desde ya les agradecemos a todos por estar esta mañana con nosotros. Tenemos un panel de lujo que nos va a desburrar de algunas de las enfermedades bacteriológicas que nos preocupan a nosotros, nuestros pacientes. En primera instancia, nuestro primer speaker va a ser Niels Høiby, que ustedes ya lo conocen. Prácticamente es half Argentinian en su quinta visita a Argentina. And we are very proud that he decided to darle un descanso a las Pseudomonas y empezarse a preocupar por la Mycobacteria. Así que, como ustedes ya fue presentado el doctor Høiby, él está en el Range Hospital en Dinamarca. Algunos de nosotros que tuvimos oportunidad de visitarlo, todavía estamos impresionados del nivel de complejidad de su departamento, con increíble identificación de las Pseudomonas, que ya las tratan como amigas prácticamente, todas identificadas genómicamente. Realmente un programa espectacular. Neil ha sido instrumento de todo eso y hoy nos va a dar cierta idea de gérmenes que para nosotros todavía no son muy importantes, pero como ustedes saben, los gérmenes estaban antes que nosotros, van a estar después que nosotros, y en cualquier momento la Mycobacteria va a llegar a ser un problema para Latinoamérica. Esperemos que sea lo más tarde posible. Con ustedes, Niels Høiby.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm very happy to be here and contribute to this important conference. 800 people, it's really amazing what you could do here. Let's see, they changed a little bit on, yeah, here it is. The Mycobacteria problem has emerged in cystic fibrosis patients, and we realized that a few years ago. There have been a few cases for a long period of time. This is in our own center, Cystic Fibrosis Center, where we have 317 cystic fibrosis patients. And you will see here, these are the patients with mycobacteria, non-tuberculous mycobacteria. You'll see it's a problem, as far as we can see right now, for young adults and teenagers, but not at the present time for children. And we have only a few in the old cystic fibrosis patients, but that, of course, may change. We did a Scandinavian study, which was published actually 2 years ago. In whole Scandinavia, we are about 20 million people, half as many as in Argentina, of course. And here you have the period which we covered up to 2012 here. And Denmark is this column, the black column, and then we have Sweden, and then we have Norway. And you will see that there is a rather fluctuating situation in the Scandinavian countries, and then it rises in Denmark. Now the reason is different ways of investigating for non-tuberculous mycobacteria. In our own center, we only looked for many years for mycobacteria if there was a clinical indication. In the other countries, they did it once a year. Then we started doing it once a year, and now actually I introduced that every time we culture the cystic fibrosis patients, we look for mycobacteria, and that's the reason for the rise. So it's just, if you look for it, you will find it, and that's the background. And you will see here the rise of the Mycobacterium. It's, as you can see here, Mycobacterium abscessus is a predominant one. And then we have the Mycobacterium avium complex. This is a complex, the Mycobacterium abscessus complex, and the avium here. And then we have other mycobacteria, as you can see here. So Mycobacterium abscessus is the predominant one in our center. And a few of the patients will have more than one mycobacteria, as you can see here. These are those patients who have more than one mycobacteria, and it may be a combination of Mycobacterium abscessus and the avium complex or some of the others. So it has become a rather complicated area for most of us. In Denmark, for many years, we relied upon centralization of detection of mycobacteria. That's at the State Serum Institute. But now we took over in my own lab, and we use the State Serum Institute as a reference institute where we get confirmed which kind of species we're dealing with. Now, for routine in my own laboratory, we want to see if cross-infection occurs, and we use routinely pulse field gel electrophoresies, which can also be used for mycobacteria. It's a little bit more difficult than with, for instance, Pseudomonas, but this is what we do. We have also, together with the other center in Denmark, in Aarhus, the second largest city in Denmark, done research on using two other ways of typing, and we found that there's very limited cross-infection occurring in our center. And you know, last year there was this publication, international publication, where the authors had looked upon mycobacteria from many different centers in Europe. And the Danish part of it is shown here. And as you will see, there are, this is including not only my center but also the other center, there are three small cohorts where you have the same clone occurring. This one, and this one. One of them is siblings, so it's not surprising that they get the same species or clone. But however, it's very difficult to tell whether we have a common cause, a common source, or whether there's really cross-infection going on. But we suspect that some cross-infection is actually occurring, but very limited. So three cohorts here, or clusters here. So at that time we had in Copenhagen, our own center, 38 patients with non-tuberculous mycobacteria, mostly abscessus, and we had 3 clones, but most of them were not related. So it's limited cross-reactivity, probably due to the hygienic precautions which we have introduced many years ago and which also protect against cross-infection with mycobacteria. So that is the situation. When we grow them, of course you know that it takes time. The rapid growers, like abscessus, we have to wait nearly 1 week until we can see the bacteria. And here, when we have Mycobacterium avium, it takes 2 weeks or something like that. Very small colonies. So we have to wait until we have the results. Now, the most important thing, looking at Mycobacterium abscessus at least, and related in the same complex, is that they are actually growing in clusters. This is from sputum, as you can see, acid-fast bacilli. See this, it's a cluster here. They are small aggregates, as you can see here, small aggregates of the bacteria. If you grow them in a flask, they also come out like aggregates. These aggregates are actually biofilms. They grow like biofilms in vitro, and it also looks like a biofilm here. Now, we published a paper, I think it was 2 years ago now, where we investigated further, and we found that Mycobacterium abscessus infection in cystic fibrosis patients is a biofilm infection. And the important thing is that we could find, this is from explanted lung where we look for it. And we can find aggregates, biofilms of Mycobacterium abscessus in the alveolar wall of the lungs. And there is an inflammation around that, and we can find it several places. So the most important thing from my point of view is that the pathology of Mycobacterium abscessus in cystic fibrosis patients resembles actually the pathology you see with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It starts in the alveoli, and they make small aggregates, which is a biofilm, and then later on you can detect them in sputum, but it's not always possible in the beginning and to detect them by culture in sputum. And that's the same thing you see with Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So how important is this Mycobacterium abscessus, especially for the lung function in cystic fibrosis patients. Now, we investigated a cohort of patients born in 1974, 84, and so on and so forth. And some of them had Mycobacterium abscessus, some of them had Mycobacterium avium complex, and you have them also here. And some of them, as you can see here, had also at the same time chronic infection with Pseudomonas, or Burkholderia, or Stenotrophomonas, or Acinetobacter. So these patients who have already chronic infection with these gram-negative bacteria, they have been exposed to a lot of antibiotics, including azithromycin. So that means that the Mycobacterium will be exposed to these bacteria because these patients, for these antibiotics, because these patients are treated for Pseudomonas or Burkholderia infections anyway. Now, if we look at what happens with the lung function when they have these infections, you can see here. This is the decrease of lung function on an average per year. And we use Pseudomonas aeruginosa, you see at the present time, because we have efficient treatment, the decrease of lung function is only about 1% per year. But if you look at Mycobacterium abscessus, you can see here, then the decrease is much higher, as you can see, at least 2% per year. So this is the worst of the infections at the present time among our cystic fibrosis patients. And that's probably because we don't treat them in the optimal way. And I don't know exactly what is the optimal way, but it's difficult to treat these patients, as you can see here. However, if we are able to eradicate Mycobacterium abscessus, then they have been cleared, as you can see here, then the situation changes completely. See, this is the decline in these cohorts of patients, the decline of the lung function. This is the onset of the chronic infection with either Pseudomonas or Acinetobacter, Burkholderia, Stenotrophomonas, or Mycobacterium abscessus or Mycobacterium avium. You see, the worst of them is actually Mycobacterium abscessus at the present time. But the good thing is, if we are able to eradicate the bacteria, if they can clear it, but that only happens in about less than 1/3 of the cases, maybe I think it's 28% in our own cases. So if we're able to clear it, as you can see, then the decrease of lung function is following the same line as before they got Mycobacterium abscessus. So we should try to eradicate these bacteria in order to maintain the lung function in these patients. This was published last year, as you can see here. Now, since we now believe that we are dealing with a biofilm infection, and since we believe that the pathology or pathophysiology of the infection is similar to what is going on in Mycobacterium tuberculosis, then we should be able to identify or diagnose this infection before the culture becomes positive. This is what we do in Mycobacterium tuberculosis using the old-fashioned MANC2 reaction or using the quantiferon test to see if they have the infection, but it's not obvious yet. So therefore, we developed an antibody measurements where we can detect antibody development against Mycobacterium abscessus. And this is the level of those who have Mycobacterium abscessus, a pulmonary disease, a Mycobacterium infection without pulmonary disease according to the American Thoracic Society criteria, as you can see. And then the interesting thing is, this line shows you when the culture became positive for Mycobacterium abscessus. But look, they have an increase of the antibodies before, like we see with the quantiferon test or the MANC2 test. So there is evidence that they have been exposed to these bacteria before the culture becomes positive. So at the present time, what we do is that if you look at this, we have the threshold here, and we have the threshold here, as you can see here. Sorry, it goes the wrong way. Here it comes. We have the threshold here. This is 125 the ELISA test here. And if we go to this one, this is what we do. If they have low level of antibodies, we continue with annual non-tuberculous mycobacterial culture. This, as I told you, I have changed. Now we do it every month. But that was the idea. And if it is higher, then there's an intermediate risk. And if it is much higher, as you can see here, more than 400, then it's a high risk. And then we do much more to detect the bacteria in the patients. But as I told you, we have been much more aggressive concerning culture of these bacteria in order to be able to detect the bacteria before. We did the same with Mycobacterium avium. I have a good friend and colleague who is a veterinary professor in Madison, United States. He developed an antibody test to detect a related disease in cattle. It's called Jones disease, devastating disease in cattle. And we tried, since this Mycobacterium avium is very closely related to Mycobacterium partuberculosis, which is a subspecies of avium, I thought that this test would also work in cystic fibrosis patients, and it did. As you can see here, it's published. I think it's just been published now. And you can see those with cystic fibrosis patients with Mycobacterium avium complex and pulmonary disease, according to the American Thoracic Society, they have increased level of antibodies. And we have the same situation as I showed you with Mycobacterium abscessus, that these antibodies become positive before we can culture Mycobacterium avium. So here is when we can culture Mycobacterium avium, and you see some of the patients have already raising antibodies. So this is a method which may help us identify patients at risk of developing pulmonary disease with Mycobacterium avium and also with Mycobacterium abscessus. Now, this is the way we treat the patient, and you see this is not very optimal. What we do is that we follow, at the present time, the American Thoracic Society criteria before we start treating the patients. But I think it's too late. I think we should treat them much more aggressively and earlier, because when it's follow the criteria, the therapeutic success is very low. We can get rid of the bacteria only in less than 1/3 of the cases. So we have the positive culture, we discuss what to do with the patient, we investigate with high resolution CT scan and so on and so forth. And if we think that this is an infection, then we start treating with a combination of many different antibiotics. And we do that intravenously for a long period of time. And then after that, then we continue with oral treatment for a long period of time. So these patients will be treated for maybe up to 2 years of antimycobacterial antibiotics. And some of those antibiotics, as you know, have side effects for the inner ear. As you know, they become deaf maybe. So it's really not, optimal. It's easier to treat the Mycobacterium avium, but still, to my opinion, we should change our attitude and try to treat these patients very early and aggressively, like we do with Pseudomonas aeruginosa, to prevent that we have this chronic biofilm infection. The problem when we go to look at the susceptibility to antibiotics is, at least when the chronic infection is established, then they are very often multi-resistant. This is the earliest, the first isolate from some of our cystic fibrosis patients of Mycobacterium abscessus, and you can see that in the beginning they may be very susceptible to ciprofloxacin, for instance, and to amikacin, and some of them may even be susceptible to fusidic acid, as you can see here. So we guide our treatment looking at the susceptibility testing in the beginning. But later on, they become multi-resistant. And this is really a problem where we don't have any solution at the present time. My suspicion is that we may be dealing with efflux pumps, like I showed you yesterday with Pseudomonas aeruginosa. So what we're doing now is that we try to find out whether this multi-resistance is due to efflux pump or not. And we try to find out if we, based on these results from Belgium, this is on Pseudomonas aeruginosa, If we culture and do the susceptibility testing on a different media, the cell culture, eukaryotic cell culture, if they are still resistant, or they may actually be susceptible. But this is the research we will carry out in the future to try to find out what would be the best treatment of these patients and how can we treat them early to prevent this chronic infection which is so devastating for these patients. So at the present time, the current treatment of non-tuberculous mycobacterial cystic fibrosis is not optimal. We wait too long, according to my opinion. We follow the American Society guidelines, but they are not efficient in cystic fibrosis patients. Eradication success is so limited. So we hope that new guidelines can be developed, including early aggressive eradication therapy, oral and inhalation of antibiotics, of intermittent subclinical colonization by measuring the routine antibody, which may identify early subclinical colonization or infection. So this is what we hope to be able to do. And then if we're not able to eradicate the bacteria, then we have the maintenance therapy, chronic suppression therapy of the chronic non-tuberculous mycobacterial biofilm. And the good thing is that I showed you just before that, if we look here, that many of these early identified bacteria are very susceptible to ciprofloxacin, but also to levofloxacin or moxifloxacin. But levofloxacin is marketed as an inhalation antibiotics, so it may be that we can, in the future, be able to use levofloxacin in the early eradication therapy. The future evidence will show if that is possible. And then, of course, is our in vitro antibiotic susceptibility testing optimal? I don't think so, because the in vitro results do not reflect the clinical outcome. One reason is the biofilm problem, another reason is whether the multi-resistance is due to efflux pumps. And time will show. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. We are going to leave the questions for the end. So. A continuación, la presentación va a ser del doctor Ian Balfour-Lin. He viene del Brompton Hospital y ustedes conocen probablemente una de las catedrales antifibrosis quística del mundo, siempre fue el Brompton, de la mano de la doctora Hodgson hace mucho tiempo, y él es consultor del hospital, encargado de la parte de consultor pediátrico de hace más o menos 20 años. Obviamente alguien que permanece 20 años en el Brompton tiene que ser brillante. Él se va a dirigir hoy acerca de las infecciones a hongos en el paciente con fibrosis quística. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to skip some of my slides in case you wonder why we speed on, because I think I've got about 25 minutes and I wasn't sure how long I would have. So I'm going to talk about fungal disease in CF. Yeah, that works. So most relevant is Aspergillus, that's the main one, but also, and I am going to mention these at the end, Candida, Scedosporium and Lamentaspora, and Exophiala. Okay? So let's start with Aspergillus. It's a mold, it's a filamentous fungus. It means it kind of grows outwards, and you can see the picture there at the top. And it produces spores, and because of their size, which is perfect for being respiratory inhaled particles, that's why there's such a problem. And also they can grow at body temperature. And there's several species, but it's Aspergillus fumigatus is the main one. And when we talk about hypersensitivity, again, it's principally Aspergillus fumigatus. Now, it's everywhere. I've got a few pictures here. Sweet corn, it's in buildings, it's in coral, it's everywhere. Animals can get it, soil in particular, and also building sites, which is very relevant when hospitals are always being redeveloped and wards knocked down. So the sorts of disease that Aspergillus can cause are seen here. Colonization, I put a question mark, which I'll explain in a moment, or actual lung infection, which gets called Aspergillus bronchitis in the airways, rarely aspergilloma or invasive aspergillosis, and then the issue of sensitization and actual ABPA. Colonization, it's commonly found in the sputum of CF patients, including children. So does it matter if it's sitting there? It's probably some laboratory issues as to whether it's actually detected, and there are geographical differences, and it's more common as you get older. I would say if colonization means it's present in the airways and causing no harm, and we should probably say no harm yet, because it's likely to cause problems, and we certainly in our unit have quite a low threshold for treating Aspergillus. In terms of infection or bronchitis, when does colonization become disease? Well, probably when there's an immune response and inflammation detected. And I put on the slide there the IgG to Aspergillus. 41% of 4-year-olds is detected and 98% of 10-year-olds. And certainly, if you have more than 2 respiratory samples of Aspergillus in 1 year, it's associated with a significant drop in lung function and increase in exacerbations requiring hospitalization. If your Aspergillus IgG is raised, but a normal IgE, it means there's no hypersensitivity and we're talking about bronchitis. We certainly treat this if the child's having a chest exacerbation and getting worse, and this is the only thing that we're growing. We use oral itraconazole for a month, and there's really poor evidence for that, and it's not a very good drug, itraconazole, but nevertheless that remains our mainstay. Aspergilloma, just to briefly mention, it's where you get a discrete fungal ball inside an existing cystic lesion. It's rare in CF, but is sometimes seen in adults. Invasive aspergillosis, fortunately rare. It's more common in immunodeficient children, but it can occur in CF, and certainly before I arrived at the Brompton, there was a case report published of a 13-year-old girl with CF who had died of invasive aspergillosis, so it's very devastating. Of course, now the treatment options are probably better. The intravenous antifungal treatment's available, so maybe you wouldn't die nowadays, I'm not sure. So what about sensitization? This is when there's serological evidence without an apparent clinical exacerbation. Because if you have clinical symptoms with the hypersensitivity, you're usually said to have actual ABPA. It's unlikely that there are no real consequences because it's been shown to be associated with reduction in lung function. It's not certain if it's causal or association only. I think I'll skip that actually, just for time. It's difficult to see that. So what about ABPA? That's when there's an immunological response and clinical response to the antigens, and it's Th2. It's basically like an allergy, really. And it depends if you're atopic yourself, you're more likely to get ABPA. Of course, in asthma, it's seen with adults with asthma. If a child has ABPA, we are going to investigate that child to ensure that that's not cystic fibrosis, because I have yet, and nor have my colleagues, ever seen an asthmatic child with ABPA. Interestingly, if you look at non-CF ABPA and look at the CFTR mutations at increased frequency than you would get in the general population. Also, interestingly, going on about the CFTR side, that I have a Caftor given to G551D, for which it works best, does show a marked 53% reduction in Aspergillus colonization, which is quite interesting because it would suggest that there's something about Aspergillus and CFTR abnormalities. The prevalence varies very much. So in adults, anything from the lowest was in Greece, 14%, to France, where they say 100%. I find it hard to believe that every French CF adult has got ABPA, mind you. In the UK, though, it's said to be about 70%. In children, it's clearly less than that, and it's about 9% in children. But you can see on the graph, there's the pointer, how by age 4 to 7-year-olds, it's just a few percent. 16 to 19, you're up to about 15%. Risk factors are older age, poorer lung function, frequent bacterial infections, possibly increased use of antibiotics, and possibly TOBI. I remember that in the US, before they had nebulized antibiotics, because they didn't realize that Europe had been using them for 20 years up to that stage, that ABPA was really rare, and they were always very interested in it. And somebody would present a case at the fellows meetings, and the Brits would be sitting there thinking, why are they presenting this? This is everyday stuff. Of course, it's not more common now in the US than it used to be, and they're far more used to it. And I just wonder if that's because they're now using lots of nebulized antibiotics as well. If you're atopic, it's a risk factor. Pet owners, although not all studies have actually supported that bit about pets, and there's certain genetic predispositions. The clinical picture, at first, there are no symptoms. Wheeziness and chestiness, chest pain. The chest pain is usually a bit localized. They always talk about fever, malaise, and myalgia, but I have to say I don't see that ever. But thick sputum, brown, black plugs. If you have brown or black plugs reported on the sputum or it's seen, then you have to really think, is this aspergillus? Or if they fail to respond to antibiotics, someone comes in for an exacerbation, they're not getting better, think ABPA. Then there are X-ray changes that are fairly typical, and ultimately you can get bronchiectasis and fibrosis. There's said to be no effect in longitudinal decline, and this was a large study, large registry study in Europe. But actually, I'm not sure that's strictly true, and other studies have found a decline over time. So that's why you do have to take this seriously. You get airway narrowing, gas trapping, and small airways disease quite often, and that's the issue. I'm going to ignore the American one. I'll go to the British one. Diagnostic criteria are very similar. It's essentially asthma-like symptoms, new chest X-ray changes, a high IgE and IgE aspergillus rast. But not just the total amount, it's the change you're looking for. You're looking for kind of 3 to 4-fold rise to say there's acute ABPA. You may well find eosinophilia and positive sputum or fungal hyphae seen. You don't necessarily have all of these every time. That's why there are diagnostic criteria. The aspergillus rast is one of the better tests, there's no doubt. And if it's above 5.7, you can see there's very high, 100% sensitivity, 94 specificity of distinguishing that from simple other aspergillus states. Recombinant aspergillus allergens, you don't have to read any of that on the slide, apart from the lower line, which is, it's still said, the CF Foundation, that it's a promising tool for early detection, but it's been a promising tool that has never actually delivered, and essentially it's not in clinical use, and I'm not sure of anybody actually using it. Likewise, this TARC, thymus and activation regulation chemokine, people got quite excited about it as a potential diagnostic aid, but it's not really used in clinical use, so don't go and buy it. There are diagnostic difficulties because aspergillus is so commonly grown anyway. Skin pricks can be positive in a third of patients who don't actually have ABPA. Your IgE may be high because you have hay fever or milk allergy or something like that. Aspergillus IgG can be raised, but not just with ABPA. It can be raised due to exposure. Then distal airways obstruction is very non-specific. Eosinophilia can be high with chronic Pseudomonas infection, and infiltrates on the X-ray are common. So as you can see, it's not always very obvious. Now, some X-rays. So I think you can see that. This is not a very good quality picture, but that's a big, what we would call a blobby area, just a white area there. And more importantly, 10 weeks later, it's gone. Now, if that was due to sort of a severe Pseudomonas disease, etc., that X-ray would not improve. Here's another better example. You can just see that part there and there. When you see that, and you've seen a lot of this, there's nothing else it can be. You just know that's going to be ABPA in that child. And again, 6 weeks later of treatment, and it's cleared up. And that really confirms to you what you were dealing with. In terms of CT scans with bronchiectasis, it's said to be centrally within that yellow circle. It's a bit tricky because a lot of CF patients who are developing ABPA have already got bronchiectasis anyway, so that's not very specific. This is clearly a bad example, a 10-year-old, an example of bad disease, and his boy was only 10, His IgE was 799, which is pretty high, but his specific RAS of 50 is extremely high, as were his eosinophils. And this is very bad bronchiectasis from ABPA. And you wouldn't expect to see bronchiectasis like this in a 10-year-old child who has regular cystic fibrosis, say. Things to think about while you're waiting for results to come back. Is it actually bacterial? Is a person wheezy because they've got CF asthma? Are they atopic? Have they got severe small airways disease, reflux or pneumothorax causing the pain rather than it being ABPA? When I talk about screening here, it's really always think about it. If somebody doesn't respond to IV antibiotics, why not? If they're very wheezy or have pleuritic chest pain, you must think of ABPA. We do a sputum culture every time they come to clinic, which will include culture for fungus. We do, at our annual review, we always measure the total and specific IgE, so we have a baseline. So if during that year they're developing symptoms, we have something to compare with. We also measure it when they come into hospital for intravenous antibiotics, so that if they don't respond, by the time we're thinking of ABPA, we've got the answers back. What about avoidance? Horse riding. Horse riding definitely should be avoided. If they insist on doing it, and some of our patients do, then we say don't muck out the stables. I mean, don't clean the stables, don't clean the horses, and ride in the open air. People often say don't mow the, I'm going to go backwards. Don't mow the lawn. I don't know many children who do that anyway. Building sites, pepper mills. It seems to live in pepper mills. This is another real biggie, which is compost. Compost is bad. Don't let children near it. Don't put it all over the garden, is the advice. And actually, there was a case that was reported in the Lancet, then made it into the newspapers, of an adult who didn't have CF, but he died of overwhelming aspergillosis because he'd opened up a bag of compost that had sat in a garage for a year, and the spores flew up in a sort of cloud that he inhaled, and he actually died from that. So, treatment. Steroids, oral corticosteroids is the basis of treatment. We will start at high dose of 2 milligrams a kilo a day for 2 weeks, then halve it after do that again. Then halve it after 2 weeks and halve it again. And then we will taper it slowly according to the response. And often they're on steroids for at least always 6 weeks, so 8 weeks or so. But it works, and it improves everything. Symptoms, X-ray changes, the IgE falls. And if there's no response, then they're probably not taking the steroids. That's the real thing. Don't use enteric coated. They don't get absorbed so well in CF. And there's no role for inhaled steroid treatment here at all. This is another way of treating it. It's quite interesting because this was just a case report, actually. But essentially, a small paper, but very important, and has actually changed practice. This was in Israel, where they were giving intravenous methylprednisolone 3 days a month, monthly, usually for 3 goes, or sometimes longer, actually, sometimes actually 6 yeah. And what they found was essentially it worked well with less side effects than oral steroids. And the main issue here is they're getting the steroids because they come into hospital and they have it for 3 days and then they go home again, or you can do home treatment. But it's quite a long thing. It's quite burdensome, but for significant ABPA, it does work, and we will do this quite often. Antifungal treatment, principally itraconazole initially, is to reduce the airway sort of amount of infection. There's never been a CF trial. Still remember that, only ever in asthma ABPA. But there's no reason it shouldn't work. There's a logic to why you would do it. And we will use oral antifungals for a month after we stop the steroids. The US consensus says just use it for relapse. It's twice daily dosing, and we've doubled the standard dose because the problem is it's very hard to actually get blood levels that are detectable, so probably it's being undertreated. It's poorly absorbed. You need to use the liquid, but that tastes horrible, and the children will not take it. You have to avoid it at the same time as an antacid as well, and monitor liver functions. If they relapse during the initial steroid reduction, we go back up again to the higher dose and bring it down again slower. And it is common to relapse within a few years, and then we just start again with a full treatment course. Or if they've only had oral steroids, we might well then go on to intravenous. Voriconazole, I'm going to be quick about this. We used to use it quite a bit, and we basically stopped using it. It's much better absorbed than itraconazole, and I would think works better, but it has quite a significant side effect rate, we find, particularly very marked hypersensitivity of the skin to sunlight, photosensitization. But also, there are reports of squamous cell carcinoma of the skin with this drug. And I think if you end up using it in young children for a longish time, it's making us nervous. So we have gone on to using posaconazole instead, which is relatively new azole, and we find it's perfectly well tolerated, in fact better than voriconazole. It's easier to do blood levels, and the only issue for us is it's not licensed under 18 years of age, but that hasn't stopped us using it successfully. I'm going to ignore further treatments, and I'm going to ignore omalizumab, because I want to just spend a little bit of time about other funguses. Candida. This is a yeast, and it's common in the sputum. Lots of people will have Candida there, and it always used to get ignored, because everyone said, oh, well, they're having lots of antibiotics, it must have just come from the mouth. And actually, that's probably still true, which is why it's associated with antibiotic and steroid use. Certainly in an infant, check for a nappy rash. Maybe that's where the Candida's coming from in the first place. And obviously, if they're symptomatic, local treatment. So if they've got a sore mouth or tongue or something, we would definitely treat it. It's difficult to know how significant it is when it's in a respiratory sample. Certainly, if it was on a bronchoalveolar lavage sample, we would actually definitely treat it and use oral fluconazole. Scedosporium and Lamentaspora. Lamentaspora was Scedosporium till recently. It's the classic microbiology trick of change the name every so often so that the clinicians, we don't know what's going on. It's actually the second commonest fungus that's grown in CF respiratory secretions, and it's probably underestimated in terms of its use because it's often overgrown on the bacterial plates. There was one study in Germany of 11 centres with a mean prevalence of 3%, but it varied up to 11%. You can get fungal balls, and you can get a similar picture to ABPA, where it's called allergic bronchopulmonary mycosis. We're not that sure of the significance. This is the problem. But there is a suggestion that it's not associated with poorer outcomes. So we think if we grow it, if a child is symptomatic and there's no bacteria that we're particularly growing in that child, we will assume it's causing symptoms and we'll treat it. Because if there's nothing left once you've treated the bacterial exacerbations. And for Scedosporium, we use posaconazole. And if it's Lamentaspora, we use posaconazole together with terbinafine because it's quite often multi-resistant. Voriconazole probably works better for these antifungals, so we may actually use that as well, or instead of. The final one is Exophiala, which is black yeast, so that's probably what you find most in your bathrooms. And it can, we think it can cause ABP mycosis, but it's not certain about that. And it's not certain, again, if it's sitting there in a bronchiectatic airway, is it just sitting there colonizing? Does it matter? It's a tricky one. Again, our adults will treat it in their patients if that's all that they are finding. We've hardly ever had this in children ourselves. So in conclusion, Aspergillus really is everywhere, and you must keep thinking about ABPA. Don't ignore it. It's not always easy to confirm the diagnosis, but the real crunch is X-ray changes and growing Aspergillus or plugs of brown or black sputum. The response to steroids is quick and is successful. If it's not, then they're not taking it, basically. We would always use an antifungal with it, and relapse can be a problem. In terms of the other fungi I've mentioned, it's still not yet quite certain how significant they are. I'll just leave you with my favourite beer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. continuación, nuestro próximo speaker es el doctor Héctor Gutiérrez, un hermano chileno, que aparte de todos los honores que tiene de ser jefe de neumonología de la Universidad de Alabama, tiene otros honores de los cuales me enteré ayer. Es probablemente el primer latinoamericano que logró que la Fundación de Fibrosis Quística de Estados Unidos mire más allá del muro. Y no es poco. Muchos lo tratamos por muchos años, nunca lo logramos, y Héctor realmente lo está logrando y es realmente increíble. Realmente debe haber trabajado extremadamente duro para eso. Además, hace una semana habló con sus amigos y nos ayudó para que le ganáramos el partido a Chile, que también fue importante. Bienvenido, Héctor, y adelante.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Primero, agradezco a los organizadores de haberme invitado al Congreso. Segundo, agradezco a la audiencia que me tenga la paciencia de escucharme. Y tercero, agradezco a Mendoza que me acogió hoy día. Es la primera vez que estoy en esta ciudad. Lo que voy a hablar es un poco un resumen de lo que se hace en nuestro centro en base a la evidencia que existe para el manejo de la infección por estafilococo meticilino resistente. Un poco de background: nuestro centro tiene alrededor de 300 pacientes menores de 21 años y alrededor de 160 pacientes mayores. Es el único centro de fibrosis quística en el estado de Alabama y tenemos cerca de 500 pacientes entonces. Y nuestro centro además es muy activo en ciencia básica. Alguna de las información que se ha presentado, por ejemplo, en Ivacaftor, fue liderado por algunos de nuestros investigadores, Steve Rowe, y alguna experiencia que vamos a mostrar aquí con la erradicación estaba también liderado por algunos de nuestros investigadores. Nuestro hospital tiene alrededor de 330 camas pediátricas y 110 camas de intensivo neonatal. Un poco para tener una idea de cómo es el microbioma en fibrosis quística. En este gráfico, en el eje de las X, está el paciente que avanza en la edad y también va aumentando la severidad de la enfermedad pulmonar. Y en el eje de las Y está la diversidad de la bacteria que está en el área, en las vías aéreas. Como se ve, hay una mayor diversidad en la media edad de la vida, o sea, en los adolescentes y adultos jóvenes, hay una mayor diversidad de patógenos. Por lo tanto, es más fácil encontrar que haya diferentes patógenos afectando al paciente. Al principio hay pocos, están básicamente Haemophilus influenzae y Staphylococcus aureus, no necesariamente el multiresistente o meticilino resistente, y al final están básicamente establecidas las comunidades de Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Burkholderia o Achromobacter. Cosas que son importantes en general, que el tratamiento es cuando se considera tratar una infección. En nuestros países hablamos de colonización e infección. Yo he aprendido rápidamente, a costa de golpes con nuestros pacientes, que el paciente con fibrosis quística que aparece un patógeno no está colonizado, es siempre infectado asintomático o infectado con síntomas. Por lo tanto, el considerar que la colonización está como tener estafilococo en la piel, no es lo mismo que tener un estafilococo o una pseudomonas que no está dando síntomas, porque la infección está ahí. Entonces hay que tener cuidado a identificar cuáles son los organismos que necesitan tratamiento. También hay que tener una evidencia de que si ese patógeno lleva a pronósticos, a un cuadro clínico más grave, y qué intervenciones generalmente son las efectivas. Porque eso está claro en Pseudomonas, pero no está tan claro en estafilococo. Entonces sabemos bien cuándo tratar, en qué intervenir, cómo hacerlo con Pseudomonas. Con estafilococo no es así, y especialmente cuando cambia del estafilococo multisensible a el meticilino resistente. Estafilococo en general tiene varias cosas que empiezan a afectar o a agravar la presencia, que tiene toxinas y biofilms. Esta producción se ha sido detectado en el 96% porcentaje de pacientes con meticilina resistente. Entonces, una vez que el paciente está con meticilina resistente, ese organismo ya tiene una protección contra los antibióticos que está desarrollada de por sí. También hay otras variaciones dentro de estafilococo, no necesariamente MRSA, en las cuales tienen variantes de pequeña colonia. Y luego hay otras que comienzan a tener una producción de leucocidina, que también aumenta la resistencia a antibióticos. Por lo tanto, la presencia de estafilococo, uno siempre tiene que tenerlo como estar atento si esto vale la pena tratar o no, y cuándo tratarlo. La prevalencia, esto es de datos de Estados Unidos, del registro de Estados Unidos del año 2015, la prevalencia de MRSA en los años desde el año 89 hasta el 2015 ha aumentado bastante, que ya está sobre el 25%. Es diferente a la experiencia en europea o en Canadá. Esta es la prevalencia por base etaria. En pacientes más pequeños, la presencia de estafilococo no es tan alta como en la Edad Media. Y esto del registro de Canadá del año 2013, la frecuencia, la presencia de estafilococo meticilino resistente en Canadá y Europa es bastante más baja de la experiencia que estamos teniendo en Estados Unidos. Eso nos hace a nosotros en Estados Unidos estar mucho más, probablemente más agresivos, porque tenemos mucha mayor presencia de estafilococo multiresistente. Y dentro de Estados Unidos, los estados del sur de Estados Unidos, donde está Alabama, tiene una mayor presencia. Nuestro centro tiene una prevalencia de MRSA de sobre el 30%. Ahora, esto está escrito, hay muchos estudios, el resumen, la infección crónica con meticilino resistente se ha asociado con varias cosas. Una disminución en la habilidad de recuperar la función pulmonar basal. No tenía una función pulmonar dada, se infecta con un cuadro sintomático de infección por MRSA y la recuperación se afecta. Es posible que logre volver al estado basal previo, pero en el tiempo eso es más difícil de hacer. Hay una mayor frecuencia de uso de antibióticos en estos pacientes que tienen infección crónica. Hay un mayor riesgo de hospitalización. Hay una aceleración en la declinación de la pérdida de función pulmonar. Hay un aumento en el riesgo de muerte, independiente de la severidad propiamente tal de la enfermedad. O sea, es un factor de riesgo asociado y obviamente está una disminución de la sobrevida. Consideraciones para el tratamiento del meticilino resistente. Primero, definir la infección, como se hace probablemente con Pseudomonas, es más difícil. ¿Cuándo se define una infección por MRSA temprana, intermitente o crónica? Eso no está claro. En base a la literatura no sabemos exactamente cuál es el estadio de presencia de MRSA en un paciente dado en el momento que se hace el cultivo. Y hay una falta de evidencia en la persistencia de MRSA. La detección inicial de MRSA no siempre lleva a que el paciente esté crónicamente infectado. Y de hecho, la infección transitoria es tan alta como el 50% de los pacientes. Entonces, la presencia de un cultivo positivo sin tratamiento puede indicar que solamente tuvo una infección transitoria por MRSA. Por lo tanto, ¿cuáles son las implicancias de tener un cultivo positivo? Y cuando hay un cultivo positivo, ¿qué significa? Si tiene o no una infección crónica. Podemos definir entonces tratar la infección por estafilococo meticilino resistente. Podemos dividir los pacientes en 4 grupos. De hecho, en 2, con 2 variantes. Si el paciente tiene una nueva infección o el paciente está con una infección crónica. Y si está con una infección nueva, si el paciente está sin síntomas o con síntomas. Y si tiene una infección crónica, si tiene una infección crónica asintomática, o el paciente está teniendo una exacerbación pulmonar. Ese acercamiento terapéutico, de decisión terapéutica, es el que usamos en nuestro centro. Primero, cuando el paciente tiene una nueva infección, no hay un estudio definitivo que guíe la decisión de tratar o no tratar. La presencia del primer cultivo positivo de MRSA no está claro si eso tiene que ser tratado o no tratado. Hay estudios que demuestran que si se trata se puede erradicar. Hay estudios que demuestran que si se trata desaparece pero vuelve a aparecer. Y hay estudios que demuestran que si se trata o no se trata, se observa la proyección en el tiempo, de un tiempo breve, puede que no tenga afecte al paciente individual. En pacientes de poblaciones eso puede variar un poco. Y en la infección crónica, primero, no hay un estándar de definición de infección crónica en MRSA. Hay algunos estudios que dicen que por lo menos 3 cultivos positivos en un periodo de 6 a 12 meses pueden indicar que ese paciente ya tiene una infección crónica. Entonces hacemos ya la diferencia entre 2 tipos de pacientes. El paciente que tiene una infección nueva, o de nuevo, o una infección crónica. Luego vamos a ver cómo se trata. De estos 4 grupos, el más fácil de tratar es aquel paciente que tiene una infección crónica, presencia crónica de meticilino resistente y hace una exacerbación pulmonar. En nuestro centro, si ese paciente tiene una exacerbación pulmonar, más allá de un poco de aumento de tos y nada más, pero hay una disminución en la función pulmonar significativa de más de 5 a 7 puntos porcentuales, si tiene una baja de peso o una estabilización en la curva de peso, o está con más síntomas, ese paciente se va a hospitalizar y la decisión es muy fácil. Y si uno le pregunta a los médicos que trabajan en esto, el 98% en una encuesta respondió que ellos lo tratarían. Ese no es el paciente difícil. ¿Y qué se usa? Dependiendo de la intensidad de los síntomas, nosotros vamos a usar en nuestro centro probablemente antibióticos intravenosos con hospitalización del paciente, o si el paciente está bastante más leve, pero con algunos más síntomas, medicamentos orales. Nosotros consideramos que el paciente está con una exacerbación pulmonar y nuestra primera elección es usar tratamiento antibiótico. Algo parecido puede ser el grupo número 2, es aquel paciente que tiene una infección nueva, pero está sintomático. En nuestro centro ese paciente también va a seguir esta decisión, porque tiene síntomas que antes no estaban, no hay otra cosa que le explique y aparece por primera vez un estafilococo y los síntomas son significativos, probablemente ese paciente va a ser hospitalizado por alguno de nuestros colegas. El otro grupo, infección crónica en un paciente asintomático. Ese es probablemente el grupo más difícil, porque no tiene la presencia de un patógeno, sabe que la historia natural de ese patógeno, por estudios poblacionales, no es buena, pero también sabe, por el otro lado, que hay una transitoriedad en la presencia de los cultivos de hasta un 50%. Entonces, ¿este paciente es que aparece y desaparece o tengo que tratarlo? Puede responder temporalmente o a tratamientos repetidos de antibióticos orales, pero eventualmente los tratamientos, si uno los trata todo el tiempo, va a tener menor eficacia, va a desarrollar mayor resistencia y tiene el riesgo de que el paciente comience a tener efectos colaterales, efectos adversos al uso repetido de antibióticos. Hay tratamientos, por ejemplo, antibióticos de tratamiento alterno, una opción que estuvo publicada hace algunos años atrás. En el grupo uso nebulización por vancomicina por 28 días, siguiendo el estándar de tobramicina por 28. Se repite el cultivo y si el paciente tenía síntomas cuando estaba sin los antibióticos y el cultivo todavía seguía positivo, se consideraba otro mes adicional, ya sea de continuo o se usaba otro mes adicional, 56 días, o comenzaba con un tratamiento continuo de vancomicina nebulizada, que no es un tratamiento menor. Y este es el primer grupo, un paciente que tiene una infección por primera vez, es asintomático. Ese es el tiempo ideal para erradicar. ¿Ya? Pero estafilococo también reside en otras áreas de nuestro cuerpo, cavidades nasales, piel. 30% de estas infecciones se van espontáneamente. Y no es posible saber si este paciente lo va a hacer de manera espontánea o progresará a una infección crónica. Por lo tanto, ¿qué hacemos? Mejor lo tratamos. ¿Ya? Mientras más mejor. ¿Cómo se trata? Antibióticos orales, agentes microbicidas y que se aplican a las cavidades nasales y a la piel. Y también se hace un tratamiento de los fomites y del área de vida de los pacientes dentro de la casa. ¿Qué es lo que se usó? Este es un artículo que acaba de salir publicado, fueron 14 centros. El objetivo de este estudio es buscar la eficacia microbiológica de un tratamiento en este paciente que tiene por primera vez, o ellos hicieron adquisición reciente de MRSA de una manera randomizada. La idea es si el tratamiento agresivo de una presencia incidental de MRSA va a ser efectivo en reducir la positividad del cultivo y si es clínicamente seguro. Participamos 14 centros, los edades de las pacientes entre 4 y 45 años, en el cual aparecía por primera vez el cultivo positivo y por problemas de reclutamiento, que no podían reclutar tantos pacientes, la idea era reclutar 90 pacientes, empezaron a expandir el criterio de elegibilidad y lo hicieron como positivo, early positivo, que era la presencia de hasta varios meses o casi un año atrás que haya tenido positivo y así el paciente entraba al estudio. El protocolo era fácil, usar trimethoprim sulfametoxazol y si era alérgico, aminociclina con rifampicina. Se hacían lavados bucales de clorhexidina por 2 semanas, se aplicaba bactrobanum, mupirocina y clorhexidina por 5 días al cuerpo y se hacía una decontaminación por 21 días. Fácil de hacer, todos lo hacemos. El primary endpoint fue cultivo, el estado de cultivo al día 28. Este es el grupo control, fueron 21 pacientes y el grupo tratado 24. El estudio se detuvo a mitad del trabajo porque hubo una diferencia clara en el grupo tratado y no tratado. Uno puede argumentar que usar grupos tan pequeños puede que no tenga la potencia significativa para demostrar la diferencia. Pero en el grupo control, el 26% de los pacientes estaba al cabo de 28 días. Y el grupo tratado, el 82% de los pacientes logró erradicarse. Cambio claro, de tal modo que el Safety Board del estudio decidió parar el estudio. El problema es que siguieron a estos pacientes y al día 84 y al día 168 del grupo control o del grupo tratado era igual. Fue efectivo en reducir, en erradicar, entre comillas, en negativizar el cultivo a los 28 días, pero a los 168 días los dos grupos estaban exactamente de la misma manera. La función pulmonar fue significativamente mejor en el grupo tratado en el día 28, pero luego el día 168 ya no había diferencia estadísticamente significativa. Aunque la tendencia se mantenía un poco, ya no era significativo. Entonces, ¿cuál es la bottom line? Este fue un estudio multifacético, oral, tratamiento tópico y manejo ambiental, que demuestra que hay un muy buen tratamiento microbiológico para negativizar el cultivo a los 28 días, con pocos efectos colaterales y más que nada hubo efectos secundarios gastrointestinales y relacionados con sensibilidad de la piel. Pero, ¿cuándo entonces te debe ser iniciado? ¿Al primer cultivo positivo? El problema con eso es que estamos haciendo sobreprescripción en 1/3, 1 en cada 3 pacientes no necesita eso. Por lo tanto, uno puede argumentar que es necesario o no es necesario. ¿Y cuál es el tratamiento óptimo para erradicación? Esto es difícil de hacer en la casa. Nosotros lo hemos intentado, recuerden, nuestro centro participó y hemos intentado hacerlo en pacientes fuera de protocolo, pero les es muy difícil lograr esto después de 21 días. Por lo tanto, ¿cuán generalizables son los resultados de este estudio? Puede trabajar mejor en los pacientes más pequeños, ¿ya? Que tienen enfermedad pulmonar leve. La efectividad puede ser menor en los pacientes que tienen una función pulmonar más agravada. Y la erradicación a largo plazo, que es lo que intentamos nosotros, puede que sea mucho menor que el 50%. La efectividad a largo plazo puede que no sea tanto. Y la susceptibilidad a MRSA, como vimos al principio de las diapositivas, es diferente de acuerdo al área geográfica. En Estados Unidos puede ser diferente a Canadá o Europa. En conclusión, el estudio demuestra que el tratamiento antibiótico temprano contra MRSA puede resultar en una reducción de cultivos positivos, pero eso tiene una importancia clínica a largo plazo. Eso no hay respuesta hasta el momento. ¿Cómo se usa, cómo se trata esto en general? Consideraciones con vancomicina, que es la primera elección, se usa generalmente cuando el paciente está sintomático. El problema es que tiene una penetración pulmonar mala, un sexto de los niveles en el suero, tiene poca penetración para biofilms y la dosis de meta tiene que ser una relación sobre 400 y eso equivale a dosis que son bastante altas y tienen que ser seguidas por niveles pico y de valle. Los pacientes adultos tienen una farmacocinética similar a aquellos pacientes sin fibrosis quística, por lo tanto eso se aplica a esto, pero los pacientes pediátricos pueden necesitar aún más dosis más grandes. Por lo tanto, hay que estar mucho más cuidadoso en el uso de los niveles. Linezolid, nosotros lo usamos muy esporádicamente. Mi experiencia propia es probablemente lo he usado 5 veces. Tengo actualmente un solo paciente que lo ha usado, pero algunos de mis colegas lo han usado un poco más, pero no es un tratamiento de primera, segunda o tercera línea. Le tenemos bastante respeto a la supresión de médula. Es un tratamiento alternativo, tiene una muy buena biodisponibilidad oral, tiene una penetración pulmonar muy buena. Hay concentraciones en el fluido extracelular del pulmón que es adecuado y tiene también una eficacia muy importante. La resistencia por MRSA es bastante baja. Las dosis están puestas acá. En niños, en general, la dosis de 10 miligramos por kilo es 3 veces al día, pero no logra tener la concentración inhibitoria mínima con estas dosis. Así que no se sabe realmente cuál es la dosis ideal para pediatría. ¿Cuándo preferimos linezolid sobre vancomicina? En aquel paciente que sigue sintomático y vancomicina, que es la primera elección en nuestro centro, no logra mejorar al paciente. Cuando tenemos colonias de MRSA con vancomicina en que la concentración inhibitoria mínima es sobre 2, y aquellos pacientes que tienen una enfermedad renal asociada o una historia de injuria renal aguda asociada a uso de antibióticos durante exacerbaciones pulmonares. Se monitoriza hemograma de manera semanal para la supresión de la médula ósea. Y una cosa importante que nos pasa con la cantidad de medicamentos que están los pacientes, revisar interacciones droga-droga, a veces por un síndrome de serotonina que los pacientes se asocian con depresión. Otros antibióticos posibles es la combinación de vancomicina con rifampicina. Esta combinación en estudios ha demostrado que es mayor la mejoría, un 54% versus un 31%, pero no tiene una diferencia en la frecuencia de erradicación efectiva. El problema es que hay un desarrollo de resistencia de rifampicina bastante rápida. Por lo tanto, nosotros tratamos de usarla esporádicamente, no de manera rutinaria, la dejamos como de reserva. Tiene también efectos colaterales, como toxicidad hepática y también interacciones entre diferentes medicamentos. Por lo tanto, no tenemos un rol de adicionar rifampicina a vancomicina para tratar pacientes que están con una infección crónica, sintomático y hospitalizados. Antibióticos secundarios, usamos tetraciclinas, doxiciclina y minoxiclina. No tengo experiencia con fosfomicina, se usa o no se usa casi en Estados Unidos, así que lamento no poder hacer comentarios en eso. Usamos generalmente para aquellos pacientes que están un poco sintomáticos, con síntomas muy leves, y decidimos que no se hospitalizan. Generalmente no usamos minoxiclina o doxiciclina en estos pacientes que se están hospitalizando. Tratamos de evitarlo en los niños pequeños. Y no hay estudios claros en fibrosis quística de la efectividad durante el uso propio de infecciones, exacerbaciones pulmonares. Una de las cosas que usamos sí es cuando los pacientes tienen otros patógenos asociados, asociamos en asociación con medicamentos que están, por ejemplo, tratando Pseudomonas. Un medicamento que lo usamos muy frecuentemente es el timetoprim sulfamethoxazole. Tiene una baja resistencia, desarrolla poca resistencia al MRSA. Problema es que puede favorecer la selección de estafilococos de pequeña colonia. Y se puede usar intravenoso o oral. La preferencia de nosotros es usarlo oral, generalmente, de nuevo, cuando el paciente no está hospitalizado. Y tenemos que usar dosis más altas en general porque hay un clearance bastante alto y la vida media bastante más baja. Por lo tanto, ya se usan dosis más altas cada 12 horas o dosis más frecuentes en vez de 12 horas, 3 veces al día. Y generalmente lo usamos como una segunda opción cuando hay un paciente con coinfección, por ejemplo, con Stenotropomonas maltophilia o con Burkholderia cepacia. Otros antibióticos que usamos frecuentemente es clindamicina. Tiene una buena distribución en el pulmón, pero desarrolla resistencia un poco más frecuente de lo que quisiéramos, y no hay estudios controlados que evalúen la eficacia. Nuevos antibióticos que estamos usando, pero no los voy a discutir, es ceftarolina y tegiciclina. Tegiciclina estamos usando más que nada para el uso de cobertura en pacientes con infecciones por Mycobacterium no tuberculoso. Creo que esa es la última. My timer. Muchas gracias. Estas son otras cosas, pero no las voy a pasar ahora.
Preguntas.
Quisiera preguntarle al doctor Gutiérrez la dosis que usa para la vancomicina inhalada en qué situaciones la indica.
Mala pregunta. No la sé. No la usamos mucho. Yo no la uso mucho. Colegas la usan. Pero se las puedo dar. En general es un vial que se diluye en 5 ml y se da la nebulización propiamente tal. Pero les puedo dar la información luego de la visita.
Perdóneme, hace como 2 años se presentó un trabajo de un producto que teóricamente se iba a llamar Bank Air, que usaba dosis muy bajas de vancomicina inhalada y que estaba en fase 2 ya en ese momento. ¿No pasó más nada con...? No. Okay.
Yo tengo 3 preguntas para Nils Hoiby. Voy por la primera. Si tienen experiencia o usan en el centro de ustedes el medio RGM, medium, para aislamiento de micobacterias.
No, the medium we use for isolating mycobacteria is a Cepacia medium, because you have to have a selective medium because of all the other bacteria, and it functions very, very good. But there are problems with Aspergillus, as you may see. So we try to, if we can, get the laboratory which provide the media to include amphotericin B. At the present time, we have to use amphotericin B by floating the medium if there are Aspergillus.
Sí. Siguiendo con esa pregunta, entonces, en el aislamiento en el medio de Burkholderia, para aislar y para poder detectar las infecciones polimicrobianas, tocan diferentes colonias con diferentes aspectos.
Yeah, the way we do it is that have one technician who is taking care of the mycobacteria. And she looks at suspicious colonies. She do acid-fast staining, and then she subculture. But this is the problem if there are many different bacteria in the Cepacia medium, but that's how we do it at the present time.
Y la tercera es, si tienen un aislamiento, nosotros hemos tenido aislamientos en bebés de 1 año usando el método, ya detectamos bacterias en chiquitos muy pequeños y ya tenemos 2 infecciones crónicas utilizando solamente el medio BC. La pregunta es si en aquellos que se detecta una única vez y no sabemos todavía si va a tener un nuevo aislamiento, si hay que tratarlo o lo tratan o no lo tratan.
Well, first of all, the guidelines is that you have to find it once more, the American Thoracic Guidelines, and you have to see if there are any clinical symptoms and all these things, you know. My own opinion is that we should treat them, because as I showed you, it's a biofilm infection, and it's easier to get rid of them in the beginning because they are susceptible to various antibiotics. I showed you they are susceptible to ciprofloxacin, moxifloxacin, levofloxacin, susceptible also for amikacin, and sometimes also a few other like azithromycin and so on. So, to my opinion, we should treat it. But the clinicians still they don't want to do it in all the cases, really. But my opinion is that we should treat it very early.
Gracias.
Yo tenía una pregunta respecto para el doctor también sobre aspergilosis.
Espera un segundo que el doctor Balfour-Lin quiere hacer una aclaración.
Thanks. I just want to make a comment about the MRSA treatment, slightly different. One thing is that in Europe, certainly in the UK, we have intravenous teicoplanin, which is extremely effective anti-MRSA intravenous treatment that, for reasons I don't understand, is not available in the US. And there's no doubt that is our first-line intravenous treatment of MRSA if it needs to be treated that way. My second comment is relating to treating colonization on the skin. Certainly in children, you have to treat the whole family. It's not good enough just to treat the patient themselves. The whole family have to have baths in the stuff.
I may comment also that you may also have to treat the pets, you know. Actually, the dogs may be carriers if they are in such a film. It becomes very complicated.
And then you need to do it again 30 days later.
That's right.
Sí, sobre aspergilosis tenía una pregunta.
I agree.
¿Puede ser?
I agree with the type plan.
Sí, adelante.
La aspergilosis broncopulmonar alérgica es una entidad bien conocida. La aspergilosis tiene el aspergillus, lo vemos que nos da signos y síntomas tanto por inmunidad humoral, por eso aumenta el IgE, por inmunidad celular, por eso hay una intradermorreacción, tiene periodos de latencia largos. Entonces, a veces, tener los criterios completos para decidir medicar a un paciente que tuvo evolución tórpida, que ha sido polimedicado con varios esquemas antibióticos y en el esputo sigue apareciendo aspergillus, a no haber parámetros de cantidad de recuento que nos den alguna guía, estaríamos en condiciones en un paciente que está cronificado y va rotando sus bacterias y sus tratamientos antibióticos y el aspergillus persiste, indicar tratamiento. He leído algo sobre bronquitis por aspergillus y otras formas clínicas de presentación intermedia. Quería saber si estamos en lo correcto, si esto sucede y que si el paciente tiene criterio se pueda tratar o por vía oral o endovenosa de acuerdo al caso.
Thanks. Sorry, I think it was a little bit hard to translate because I can't see who was speaking, but you did it very fast. Is your question, what do we do about chronic aspergillus when we keep growing it despite the treatment? Yeah? Yeah. So that's a very difficult problem. We have some children whose IgE remains at 2,000 the whole time and who keep growing it. We will sometimes use intravenous treatment in an attempt to deal with that, but certainly we would use methylprednisolone. And sometimes we just ignore the high IgE. If the child's well, it's almost like chronic Pseudomonas infection. You don't treat it all the time with intravenous antibiotics, and we might just wait, and then if the child has symptoms, at that point dive in again. But it is difficult. You're absolutely right. The ones who constantly relapse Certainly, I would be using posaconazole or the more potent antifungals alongside the steroids. I don't know, Niels, if you want to add anything.
No, we do exactly the same thing as you do, and sometimes we use the monoclonal antibodies against IgE.
Yeah.
This is an option which we sometimes use.
Yes.
Excuse me, do you have any experience using the anti-IgE in order to be able to decrease the use of steroids on those patients?
We've actually not had to use that in the UK. There are a number of, the UK, in our centre, there are a number of case reports in the literature, and there was a randomised controlled trial that actually got started, and unfortunately they couldn't recruit enough patients, and it just stopped. So we don't really know the answer. It's quite a difficult treatment. It's certainly extremely expensive treatment. So it's something that we would consider, but haven't yet used.
¿Otras preguntas?
Una preguntita. Yo quería preguntar sobre el uso de amicacina lisosomal, que bueno, que acá no hay, usamos ampollas endovenosas nebulizables en el caso de Mycobacteria abscessus. Y muchas veces se plantea el problema de que están colonizados crónicos con Pseudomonas. Entonces mi pregunta, doctor Hoiby, o sea, es un poco derivada. ¿Qué pasa en esta asociación que hacemos, o sea, esta medicación que hacemos de amicacina nebulizable y que están colonizados crónicos? Y entonces nos encontramos en una situación de antibiótico-terapia nebulizable y quería yo saber el alcance que puede tener esta amicacina para completar el tratamiento de la Pseudomonas.
Yeah, in these cases, we stop using, say, tropomycin or colistin for inhalation because amicacine is also efficient against Pseudomonas aeruginosa, so it replaces the other nebulized antibiotics against Pseudomonas. We have have to ask ear, nose, throat doctors to examine the inner ear. I mean, if there are any hearing loss and so on. So we have to do that regularly, otherwise we may run into problems.
If I could add a comment to that. There's no doubt that we pediatricians are doing a lot of damage to children's hearing and are becoming adults with significant problems. So we have changed our practice a bit to not use aminoglycosides as much as we have in the past. If somebody's having 3 monthly, we will only use it every other time. We do hearing testing now as baseline for anybody having regular aminoglycosides or starting on amikacin for abscessus treatment. We're also starting to use N-acetylcysteine based on a paper in Thorax that wasn't anything to do with CF in terms of its otoprotectivity. It's quite an easy, cheap oral medication, and we're using that when they're having the intravenous amikacin. And we're also consenting, we're taking written formal consent from parents before we embark on this to make absolutely certain we've discussed the hearing issue properly with them.
Y yo voy a agregar otra cosa además, que es la necesidad de usar niveles plasmáticos para ajustar las dosis. Además de que se menciona la ototoxicidad, la nefrotoxicidad es más prevalente de lo que nosotros inicialmente pensábamos. En nuestro centro y trabajando con otros dentro de Estados Unidos, la asociación de injuria renal aguda es bastante más frecuente de lo que uno espera si se empieza a hacer seguimiento diario de los pacientes que están con aminoglucósidos. Así es que es esencial que tener disponibilidad de niveles plasmáticos, porque si no vamos ciegos. Y segundo, la evaluación periódica de la función renal también es esencial.
Héctor, ¿qué actitud tienen ustedes con el MET-IS sintomático? Es decir, nosotros tenemos un número de pacientes con múltiples cultivos hechos en distintos laboratorios, tanto en Córdoba como en Buenos Aires, que durante años lo único que tienen MET-IS y te hacen cuadros de febrícula que se calman únicamente, prácticamente con linezolide. Es decir, usas un tiempo el Bactrim, se mejoran, se hace resistente al Bactrim, pero que es el único germen aislado, es el METIS, y prácticamente...
Cuando tenemos un paciente que lo único que crece en cultivo es estáfilo, ya sea MSC o MRSA, y falla el tratamiento de manera repetida, empezamos a sospechar que hay otros patógenos que no están siendo mostrados en el cultivo, y hacemos investigación microbiológica, ya sea por lavado bronquialveolar, o a veces tratamiento empírico, en el cual asumimos, por ejemplo, que el paciente puede tener una infección por Pseudomonas que no la estamos tratando, y vemos la respuesta clínica. Pero eso es, en general, aquel paciente que tiene síntomas recurrentes, que responde por un periodo breve al tratamiento y luego vuelve a recaer, y lo único que aparece es solamente un monocultivo. Pero puede que haya más que un patógeno que uno no lo está cubriendo.
Sí, sí, eso es lo que nos lleva a nosotros, inclusive a mandar a diferentes laboratorios de referencia, y todos te vuelven con el mismo METIS, con las mismas sensibilidades. Siempre uno sospecha, ¿viste?
Ricardo,
que tiene un zoológico en lugar de tener un
Ricardo,
solo bicho. Pero...
la posibilidad es que haya la variante Small Colony Varia, que puede ser tanto el METIS o el METIR, y eso es lo que hace que no responda a la antibioterapia convencional.
Sí, las small colonies se alimentan de parte del bacterino, entonces, y muchos de esos pacientes nosotros, a pesar de que no lo queremos hacer, los ponemos con linesolide y es espectacular. En 3 días se le fue la fiebre, el chico, el esputo desaparece, el bicho sigue ahí, obviamente disminuye la cantidad nada más, pero tenemos un número de pacientes que se comportan exactamente iguales.
Can I make one comment also about linezolid? Don't forget just the comment about linezolid is optic atrophy. It can be a dangerous drug if it's used long term, so you must keep the eyes being checked as well by an ophthalmologist.
I may say in my country we are much more aggressive against Staph aureus, whether they are methicillin resistant, which are less than 2%, or sensitive. So we treat all the patients with positive cultures of Staph aureus for 2 weeks with a combination therapy. We haven't used sulfatrimidoprim because of the small colony variance problems. So we use fusidic acid and dicloxacillin if it's susceptible, or fusidic acid and rifampicin or clindamycin if they're susceptible, for 2 weeks. If it recurs at the next monthly examination, then we treat them for 1 month, and we continue with the combination, and then we continue for 2 more months with dicloxacillin. And in that way, we have less than 5%, which are chronic, defined by being present for 6 months or more. And if you follow them for 2 years, we don't have any that are continuously chronic. But this is a very aggressive therapy.
And I want to agree with that as well, actually. I cannot understand the stance in the US where they think that Staph aureus, it doesn't matter if you have Staph aureus. Of course it matters. Sorry.
No. El problema es que la prevalencia en la comunidad, no solamente de Staph aureus, de MRSA, pero la prevalencia en la comunidad en Estados Unidos, especialmente en el sur de Estados Unidos, es muy alta. Y nuestra prevalencia de Staphylococcus aureus, no solamente MRSA, de Staphylococcus, es sobre el 45%. So, no importando qué es lo que hacemos, al paciente de nuevo aparece. Y ahora, si uno analiza un poco el factor protector de MSC, no MRSA, y era una poco de las cosas que tenía de Ted Lieu, el análisis de sobre 260.000 episodios, era claro que el efecto protector de MSC en mantener la función pulmonar y prevenir la infección crónica por Pseudomonas. Eso no significa que nosotros favorezcamos al paciente con MSC y lo mantengamos, pero para MRSA tenemos tal grado de falla a la erradicación por la exposición repetida en la comunidad, que los efectos adversos de medicamentos es lo que nos hace ser como tirar la esponja. Throw the towel. That's the problem.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Que ya estamos
Doctor.
terminando.
Al doctor Lin, quisiera preguntarle a un niño que tiene diabetes y tiene aspergilosis broncopulmonar alérgica, ¿qué tratamiento elegiría? ¿Iniciaría directamente con los corticoides teniendo en cuenta los efectos adversos o elegiría el itraconazol o voriconazol?
I would use exactly the same treatment, including the steroids, and end up giving more insulin during that period. And yes, it's very difficult. There's no doubt if someone's got diabetes and they're on a low dose of insulin, it really mucks up their control. But then we have a CF diabetes consultant who works with us and she helps us out.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a los expositores y a ustedes por aguantarnos.
It's interesting you have so much MRSA. I realize it's in the country.
Okay. El simposio de Vertex se va a iniciar a continuación. Lo único que tienen que salir y buscar el lunch y volver a entrar si les interesa quedarse.
And now we are very afraid of NTM as well.
Oh yeah, be afraid of obsessors. Be afraid. Oh, hi. Well, maybe they. Or, do you want to translate it? Oh, you're going to speak. Yeah, I understand you.
Hola. Perdón, voy a repetir porque hay algunos que me preguntan de nuevo. ¿Pueden salir, buscar el lunchbox y volver a ingresar a la sala? Se puede comer acá adentro siempre y cuando se dejen después las cosas en el cesto de la basura. Pero pueden ingresar, así empieza el simposio de Vertex. Gracias.
Something that people think about it as does it cause infection? You should ask them. Probably, I mean, he's the microbiologist, but we don't use galactomannan. Now I don't know if it's because maybe it's not available